after the big demonic scene and institutionalizing of the younger brother, like I said in the first part, I decided I needed to go home. When I got home, I remember this moment very distinctly. I was crying. I was just sobbing in the kitchen. And I stood in the middle of my kitchen. I said, God, I know things are about to get crazy. I don't know how crazy. It's already crazy. I've already witnessed crazy. And I have the distinct feeling it's going to get a lot crazier. And when it does, I need you to promise me not to let go of me. No matter what I do, no matter how I react, know that I know you're real, I love you, and please don't let go of me. And I remember making that request very distinctly and with as much heartfeltness as was possible. So like I said in the first episode, they called me and wanted me to make sure that he stayed institutionalized, and I said no. Once I said no, I went, and I'm still, mind you, going back and forth to this church, to the services and things like that, and they're still trying to carry on these services as if nothing had happened. And there was a sense of, oh, poor Kathy, she's lost them, and there's just all this, grief and sadness and pouring out of me. And I'm looking for comfort. I'm looking for not comfort in the people. I'm looking for comfort from God. But I also know in the back of my mind all this craziness is going on within this first family. But I'm not saying anything. If you know me personally, you know my personality type is, and I think this is why I am so popular as a senior advisor or just as someone to talk to. You can tell me anything and I won't repeat it. I don't go around carrying other people's business all over everywhere. And just by virtue of the fact that it took 30 some odd years to even tell this story, and still not mentioning names or anything like that. So I don't, and a lot of that comes from my training in theology. A lot of that comes from the pastoral counseling, those kinds of things. It's just a vow that we take of not repeating anything that we heard. And by the way, let me clear that up. I'm not a pastor. So anyway, I'm going back and forth to the church. I'm doing a lot of praying. I'm doing a lot of seeking comfort in God. I'm doing a lot of studying. The pastor and I are talking a lot. We got to be close in the friend sense. I looked at him as a father figure or as a father-in-law type figure, and that was kind of the relationship that we had. However, with the rest of the family, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of what I come to realize now was jealousy. There was a lot of just plain evilness going on in that family. That's about when the false prophecy started. When I say false prophecies, it is another crazy type story. We would be in the middle of services. There was this one group or clique of people that surrounded some of the members of the first family, some of the daughters in the first family. They were just like, it was just like high school. They were just like a pack of vicious, mean girls. Anybody that didn't fit into their clique, and I no longer fit because the brother was gone, the beloved brother was gone, and I wouldn't help with the younger brother, keeping him away. So I kind of didn't fit anymore. So we would be in the middle of a service, and all of a sudden, one of the women in this clique would suddenly have this revelation from God and jump up and interrupt the service. And if you have any kind of training, religious training, theological training, church training, you know that God is not a disorderly God. So he's not going to make somebody jump up in the middle of something else happening to say something. If he's got something to say, he's going to say it to the individual, or he's going to say it in a decent and orderly fashion. He's not going to jump up or cause somebody to jump up and disrupt the service. But these people would jump up and disrupt the service and would start talking as if it was God coming through them, and they would start accusing her of And, everybody would kind of look at me in this clique when they said that. So that would cause all the rest of the congregation to look at me. But God would accuse her of trying to take over the church and just all kinds of vile, bad things. And it started me wondering within myself, it's like, am I thinking stuff that I'm not really aware of? I mean, I'm really going through some changes now because this isn't the first time this has happened. So we got all these false prophecies coming up, and they're just coming like in Sunday service and Wednesday night Bible study, and they're coming really strong. And they would always stop just short of naming who her was. The people in the first family would come to the rescue and jump up and beg God. I mean, it was a real show. They would jump up and beg God, please don't name her, don't embarrass her like that, and we'll help her, and all this kind of stuff. And it was an interesting show. And like I said before, I was really very naive and very young at the time, so I'm confused at this point. I'm thoroughly confused because I know the pastor, the father, is telling me one thing, is saying one thing, and then these people who are supposedly speaking the voice of God are in the middle of services doing something else. So I knew something wasn't right here. They're just, something was going just terribly wrong in this situation. What made me realize eventually, and not that long, but at the time it seemed like an eternity, these people, even though they were the wife and the children of this pastor, they didn't necessarily know what was going on biblically with the church or with the pastor. They had their own agendas going, and some of these agendas didn't mesh, but there was a very vicious battle for control and for taking over. I'm not sure whether it was greed because of the amount of income that was coming in. I'm not sure whether it was jealousy of the attention or the fame. I'm really not sure what it was, but I know that they had no clue of what was going on. And the two things that happened, we were in this building across the street, and actually it was outside of the building. I was standing outside of the parking lot, and the pastor's wife came up to me, which was in itself odd because she usually didn't speak to me. Even though I was engaged to her son, she usually didn't speak to me. But she came up to me and she said, God told me to tell you that you need to work on being fragmented, that he sees you as being fragmented, and that there's no shame in going and talking to the pastor. So she tells me that God is saying that he sees me as needing to talk to the pastor. That right there let me know that, one, she had no idea what was going on in her own household or with her own husband, because at that point I was talking to the pastor probably more than they were, because we had that symbiotic relationship of his son and him needing to know what type of person his son was, and I was the one that could supply that information. And now that I think about it, all these years later, I think it's very odd that he didn't pull close to his family. I guess he realized that they didn't know who he was either, that he had to get this information from me. So we developed a friendship. There was nothing sexual, there was nothing untoward, there was no romantic anything like that. It was truly like a father-in-law talking to a daughter-in-law about his son. Like I said, now that I think about it, it was information he should have gotten from his kids or from his wife. So he and I were talking on a regular basis, and his background education, the pastor's background education, was in mental health. He wasn't a psychiatrist or anything like that, but his background was in mental health. So he was actually helping me deal with the grief and things. So, if there was any fragmenting going on, it was a fragmenting with her and their family. It was not fragmented with me. So I realized then that she had no clue. She had no clue about what he was doing in the church. She had no clue about what he was doing as far as talking to people. She had no clue about what was going on with her own children. That was the first thing that let me know that something wasn't right about them. The second thing was she decided wearing certain feminine hygiene products was against scripture. So she came out with an edict forbidding the women of the church to wear anything but pads. And that's the point that started driving me to the Bible, to see where that was scriptural. Because all the time all this stuff is going on, I'm still talking to God. I have never been one to just accept what a person told me, and especially in something as important as this, because by this time, in my mind, I realized that, one, I'm doing all this outside education in theology and world religion, and I'm not an easy person to convince of something. I need to have facts, I need to have proof, and I was finding proof for the fact that God was real, not only from things that I experienced that I could not explain and could not deny, but from scriptural basis. And in order to do that scripturally, you have to believe that the Bible was inspired by God. And I went through the whole thing, well, there's contradictions, there's this, that, and the other. But once I started actually studying it and going through the who, what, when, where, and why of what was being said and how it was being said and who was talking, it's not contradictory, which is an amazing feat, since it's a combination of books written by different people over an extremely long period of time for one book to have been compiled into being one book and written, and it is extraordinarily complete. So I'm a writer, and I've been a writer for a long time, so I know how difficult that task would be, even if it wasn't a divinely inspired book. I'm now at the point where I'm realizing I'm still new to this church situation, but I know where to find information and to find help. And the thing about it was, the pastor must have seen this in me also, because he was the one that was encouraging me to get the education, and he would answer questions and things like that. So I'm saying, we're close. At the time, she's telling me there's no harm in me talking to him. So when she came out with the women having to wear pads only, I go to the Bible and I'm seeing, I can't find any place in here that it says this. So I'm realizing that, okay, they're just kind of making this stuff up as they go along based on what she feels and what they feel. And that's when I learned the very valuable lesson of, you can't believe everything you hear or see, apparently with the false prophecies, in church. No matter who it is that's speaking, whether it's the pastor, the pastor's wife, kids, somebody who's supposed to have some big high leadership position. I'm not saying don't listen to them at all or rely on your own understanding, but you have to check what they're saying. If it's something that just doesn't sound right, and you know when something doesn't sound right. If it's something that doesn't sound right, or something that they're coming across as an edict coming from God or coming from the church saying that, okay, it has to be this way, or you have to believe this, or you have to believe that, that's when you start checking against the Bible and what the Bible says about the subject. And if God's going to tell you something specifically for you, if he does not tell you himself directly to you about it, and he brings it through somebody else, there's always going to be some confirmation. It's never going to be something that's against scripture, and there's always going to be some sort of confirmation from somebody about it. Anyway, that's when I realized, okay, this isn't right. There's something going on. So at this time in my personal life, I'm getting over the grief. I realized this, okay, that whole way I thought my life was going isn't going to go that way. And I went to find my childhood sweetheart. And I went to find him because we were probably closer than anybody. And he was my go-to when the world got weird. And my world had just gotten very, very weird. I'm witnessing this screaming demonic person. I've joined this church, first of all. I'm witnessing this screaming demonic person I've got these people that are angry with me because I won't step in and do something that deep inside my gut is telling me no, don't do. Now I've got all these false prophecies coming out saying that I'm trying to do this and I'm trying to do that. I've got a church mother who's telling me I'm fragmented and I should, God's telling her things about me that he isn't saying anything to me about. So I go to him and I run the situation down to him. I tell him everything that's going on, everything that's happened. And he says, okay, tell you what. And at the time I ran back into him, like I said, we were childhood sweethearts, but he actually married someone else and had 2 children, a life. But by the time that I ran back into him, by the time I came back to him to tell him about this situation, because there was a time period when I was with the pastor's son, we didn't talk because I was otherwise occupied with the theater and school and things like that. So we didn't really talk too much. And he was married, and I didn't want to interrupt his family life. So we got back together, is the bottom line. He said, okay, I tell you what, I'm going to come with you to this church and I'm going to help you figure out what's going on. So he comes with me to the church, and instantly the first family decides that I am offering them a replacement for the son that they've lost. And they so much as actually verbally said that. So he joins the church because he's intrigued at this point. He comes in and he's very intrigued about what's going on because he can't figure it out either, why they are going through the things that they're going through. So he joins the church. They look at it as, okay, this is her peace offering. She's offering us this guy as a replacement for our brother. He decides he doesn't like that, and I don't like that because that's not what the intention was. When they realized that he and I were not, in fact, trying to make him a replacement, then they doubled down on the anger and the hatred and the campaign against us. So now it's not only are they against me, they're against him too, which, of course, intrigued him more because they don't know him. They didn't know me for that matter, but they don't know him. So this goes on for a little while, and he, who, by the way, we eventually got married, so I'm going to refer to him as my husband. He was not my husband at the time. So my husband, who was working at a place, had joined the church, going back and forth to the church, and he lived by himself in a house. And everything was, we were, like I said, we were going back and forth to church, not necessarily together. We would always meet up at church, but all of this weird stuff was going on, and we're trying to figure it out. So then all of a sudden, we hear that the younger brother is being released from the mental institution. So it's like, okay. Now, I know what I heard and saw, and also by this time, I know enough to know that, one, I never question what God does with somebody else. So what I'm hearing is, because I thought it was odd that all of a sudden the first family was very accepting of this young man coming back. And right there I thought, okay, if I had testified against him and they had kept him, then I would be really the bad guy at this point. But I didn't remind them of that. I just sat back and watched what was going on. But he was getting released, and he was getting released because he had had a sudden conversion while he was in his padded cell, and he realized the error of his ways, and God was in him again, and he was very, very contrite and very pious and very religious, to the point where it was stereotypically hilarious. He would walk around, he got out, and he would come back to church, and he would come in the church, and he would have his hands clasped together, and he would have his Bible under his arm, and he would have his head down, and he would walk very slowly, and he would lift his head slowly, and he would have that big-eyed puppy dog look. And I'm looking at this dude, and I'm knowing this is an act. There is nothing contrite or holy in this act that he's putting on. And he would come in and he would sit down and he would be quiet and he would, do all these things. And he suddenly needed a place to live. He decided he did not want to live with the family anymore. So my husband, who had this house, and he was living in the house by himself, he asked him if he could come and stay with him. Now, right there, it raises red flags. He doesn't know my husband. He just knows of him because he was in the institution when my husband came into the church. So my husband and I talked about this and said, okay, there's something going on with this, because right now they hate us because you won't be, this other son that's passed away. So my husband says, okay, yeah, sure, you can come stay with me. And he was like, well, okay, he needed to stay with him, and while he was looking for a job, and everything was fine. Him trying to convince my husband. So my husband lets him stay there. So the young man comes back. He decides he wants to be the choir director. By that time, I had gotten out of the choir. It was too work intensive. It was the choir, and then they broke off into a smaller group that was an ensemble that they wanted me to be part of. And I knew that my singing voice was not that good, so I'm leery at this point of anything that these people are doing and saying. So I just backed out of all of it and just like, no thanks, I'll just keep doing the things that I'm doing. The younger brother moves in with my husband. He started being the choir director. I had other positions. I had by that time I was a missionary. You had to be a missionary before you could be a minister. So I was doing like work in the church. I was cleaning, getting ready for communion, setting up the flowers, doing things like that. A social missionary at the time, I believe they called them. So I was doing that stuff, but I would be there when choir rehearsal was going on, which was on a Tuesday night. And I would hear this younger brother who would be going along fine, and then he could not quite control that demon in him very well, because there was a couple people within the choir that for some reason that demon just did not like, because he would be going along fine, and then that crazy, screechy, gravelly voice would come out, and he would like verbally attack this one or two people for singing off key, or for missing a cue, or some whatever they did. It was some minor infraction, and this demon would come out and just start screaming and berating this person till they were just in tears and they couldn't sing anymore. And nobody seemed to think this was odd. Nobody in the first family recognized that voice that came out of this guy. I recognized the voice that came out of the guy, but I'm not saying anything. And every time it happened, when the demon realized that he had come out and would like go back in, he would turn around and look at me. And it was like, okay, this is getting creepy. This is getting like a scary movie. And I've already told you all how I feel about them scary movies. So he would go home to my husband's house. My husband finally came to me and told me, he said, I don't know what you know about this guy, but I hope you know that he's bringing men in and having relations with men in this house. And I've told him time and time again, you can't do this. You can't bring these men here. This was very much against what this church believed in. So this guy was at church trying to be pious, not doing a very good job of it, but trying to be pious and holy, sleeping with men outside of the church and screaming at people while he was conducting the choir rehearsals. So, needless to say, my husband and myself apparently were the only two people who knew that whatever conversion he was supposed to have had while he was in the institution either did not stick or was a lie. So right as we were sitting down trying to figure out what we were going to do with this information, another situation pops up. My husband was telling somebody at his job about the church. It was a man. That guy decided he was going to come to the church. Because right now, it's like I said, this is like one big, humongous mystery. So that guy decided he was going to come to the church. Now, they weren't real close friends, but they were co-workers. So the guy comes to the church. he joins the church. When he came to the church, he was married and had a job, worked with my husband, and had a house. Regular American dream family. When he got into the church, I'm going to say, and these next few things I'm going to say, try to say as much factually as I can. I have a theory about what I think happened, and I'll tell you that after I tell you the facts. A little while after he joined the church, he decided he was in love with the oldest daughter of the pastor. The pastor told him, not only is my older daughter married and has children, you're married. So if you believe that you're in love with her, you'll have to not be in love with her, because God does not break up marriages and families. I don't know what happened to cause these next set of circumstances, but the guy who thought he was in love, his wife left him, he lost his house, and he lost his job. So he's totally distraught. He can't have the woman that he thinks he loves. He's lost his wife, he's lost his job, he's lost his house. Can't move in with my husband because my husband has the younger brother living there. The younger brother at this point has decided that he's a minister, that God has called him to the ministry. So he's coming to my husband's house, but he can't live there. So when he's coming to the house, he's around my husband and this younger brother. The next set of things that happen is where we get to the murder part. I'm going to explain what happened, and then I'm going to tell you what my theory is behind all of this. And believe it or not, this is just part 2. There's a third part of what happened after the murder. Okay, so the situation is this. Youngest son is having relations with men, living with my husband, who was not my husband at the time, but living with my husband. My husband's telling him, you can't do this. This is wrong. You're fooling the church. You're making the church think you're one way, and you're not that way. The friend that my husband invited to the church falls in love with the first daughter, loses his wife, his job, his house, and the first daughter, and is told by the pastor you can't be with the first daughter. So he's distraught. We're sitting in a Sunday service, and we're in the building across the street. We're in the smaller building, and we had a service there. We had a Sunday service there, and it was the service before Independence Day. And I remember this because the pastor was preaching on the meaning of independence and Independence Day. And we're all sitting there. We're sitting on chairs. They had to set up chairs because there was no pews over there. So we're sitting on chairs, and I had a baby on my lap. Baby couldn't have been older than 8 months, maybe. And the guy who was told that he could not be in love with the pastor's daughter, the pastor's preaching, he comes in, and the door entrance is off to the left. So when the door opens, because it's quiet, when the door opens to where we were at, you could hear it. So everybody kind of glanced over to the left to see who it was, and it was this guy from my husband's job. And he comes in. Oh, he's late for service because now we're in the middle of the actual sermon, but maybe he had something to do, maybe he had to work. And he walks and he stands right in front of between where everybody was sitting, facing the pulpit and the pastor preaching. The pastor never stopped preaching. He looked at the guy, and they were locked eye to eye, but he never stopped preaching. What was going through my mind was, I thought, okay, maybe he really, really wants prayer. Maybe he's going to say he's sorry, or I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but maybe he really, really wants prayer, and he's just waiting for a break in him to stop talking. And then the next things that happened in my brain happened in slow motion, and I think it was because of the trauma of it. The guy reaches around to his waistband in the back, and he pulls out a gun, and he brings the gun around, and he shoots the pastor point blank in the heart. Everybody was silent for about a fraction of a second, and then they screamed and dropped to the floor. I never screamed. I never dropped to the floor. I sat the baby down on the floor, but I was the only one still sitting up in the chair watching what was going on. Because to me, like I said, everything had slowed down, and it was like watching some bizarre, horrifying movie. And I never was concerned about my well-being. I didn't want the baby to get hurt. But the thought of him turning the gun and shooting people in the congregation, that never crossed my mind. And it never crossed my mind that he could turn around and shoot me. Now, he went to point the gun at the other minister that was sitting behind the pastor, and then that's when the men of the church jumped up and actually wrestled him down to the ground. The guy could not understand what was going on. He said God had told him to come in and shoot this pastor and kill this pastor. At that point, once we all got over the shock, people start breaking for the door, and people are screaming and they're crying and they're breaking for the door. Somebody had the presence of mind to call the EMT, roll the pastor out, who is on his last clinging, gasping breaths of life, and dies as he's going past me on a stretcher. It was a horrible, horrible event to witness. It was a horrible event to be a part of. And to this day, I still have PTSD in certain situations. And I'm going to tell you just a quick side note. I never was angry with God. I was disappointed and really, really leery of the people in the church, but I was never angry with God about anything. In the next part, you'll find out what happened afterwards and stuff, but I'm going to fast forward you for a quick time. Where I'm at now is all the way on the other side of the country from where this happened. And I went to a church here, and I don't go into a church building very often, one of the issues of PTSD, but I went into this church building, and I was actually going to this church for a little bit because I was driving some seniors there because one of the ladies has gotten too old to drive. So I would drive and I would sit through the service. One particular service, believe it or not, we were held for a little while in this service, and afterwards come to find out a man had come into the lobby with a gun, and they had to actually talk him down and out of this lobby. And I'm thinking to myself, what are the odds that all these years later, totally different church, totally different people, totally different everything, and almost the exact same situation is going to happen again? That was just a little bit too much for me, and it was like, okay, I'm sorry, ladies. You're going to have to find another way to get there. I can't drive you to church. And it kind of worked out because I started having some physical issues too, but it was crazy. So that's where we're going to leave off on this episode. In the next and final episode about what happened, as wild and crazy as this sounds, you're not going to believe what happened after this.